Welcome back to the Faith Forward podcast. John Ackerman, joined this week by my good friend Lee Towns.
How are you, sir?
I'm good. Thanks for being here.
It's good to be here.
You doing well today?
I am. You?
Yeah, we're here. It's Thursday morning. It is Thursday morning. And this is the last week in this series that we've been focusing on the book of Colossians and the reality that Jesus is greater. And so for the previous 8 weeks, hopefully you've caught some, if not all. If you're just now joining us, this is your first episode, welcome. Go back and check some of that out, because this really is the closing. You are the closer.
I am the closer. That's right.
And so the friendly reminder, as usual, that if you did not catch the Sunday message prior to this, go back and check that out, because that's where all of the context for what we're going to talk about comes from. But also recognizing that sometimes you're going to catch this days, weeks, months later, and you were here for the message. So Lee, if you want to give people a short summary of what you think you're going to talk about on Sunday, since this is Thursday and it's still baking. Yeah. And then we'll dive into how do we make this practical.
Yeah. So as John said, I am the closer for the series. It's a little like you're making the closing arguments. I was thinking the other day about that movie, A Few Good Men, and the walkaway line that even now, decades later, I remember, you want the truth, you can't handle the truth. It's like that in this closing message, and it's not like that because that's what I'm going to say, but it's like that because that's what Paul does. We kind of come to the end of the letter, and there's some verses that will follow the 5 verses we're going to look at and think about, but they're his customary greetings that happen in his writing, and there's significance in that. I don't want to downplay that. It wouldn't be in the text if it wasn't important. But as far as the body of material that Paul has been talking about, it has been around the idea of the supremacy of Jesus, that Jesus is greater. And from start to finish in the series, in increments, we've looked at various ways in which Paul's built this case that Jesus is greater. And now we come to these last few statements that he's going to make about Jesus being greater, and he's making his closing argument. And he does it very succinctly. I mean, he does it in 5 verses. He gives us 3 words, or at least I pick up 3 words in his 3 kind of categories of directive. And so we lean into that, and actually what I think he does, without specifically saying this, is he says, okay, I've talked for 3 chapters now about Jesus being greater. Now, in summary, here's how you will know that you are living with Jesus in the greater than position in your life. If you are devoted to prayer, wise in how you live, and engaging in your conversations. Now, he says it, in typical Pauline language. Those are my restatements of that. And but he just boils it down to these 3 concepts that if these 3 things are happening, that we will know we've got Jesus in the right position. We've been asking that question just about every week. What position do you have Jesus in? And I'll leave that there even for you to consider throughout the course of this podcast as we, bring a summary to the series. What position do you have Jesus in? But if Jesus is greater, then Paul gives us these 3 kind of bullet points, indicators that we have him in the right place. Interestingly enough to me, I think that there's one that is a statement about the kind of effort we put in, and the other 2 are derivatives of that effort. So he talks about the idea of being devoted, and that's, okay, go to work on that. Yeah. And all the translations are consistent in how they describe that phrase. Most translations use that word devoted. A few of them will say continue earnestly, but they carry that idea of a relentless persistence to the work of prayer. Some places, I've read, and some people I've heard speak about this will talk about prayer is our first work. And Paul's reminding us this is, look, if you're going to put Jesus in the right place, you have to do the work of prayer. And I think he's, under the direction of the Holy Spirit, he's incredibly insightful in making that statement. Because I think in all of the things that are true about Christian faith, the one that we take for granted and therefore can get very lazy on is prayer. It's the one, and we do it in a variety of ways. I mean, for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's just we forget, right? Mm-hmm. It's not a natural thing because it can feel weird talking to the unseen, right? And so there's that part of it. But then there's just I notice this more often than not among people like myself who've been following Jesus. You know, if I say it out loud, well, God hears everything I say. He knows. Well, right. I don't have to talk to him about that, right? Yeah. And so we neglect the work of prayer. Or, you know, could be, oh, ye of little faith kind of thing, that we just don't think that our prayers are anything more than, you know, a talking to ourselves, and so we don't really believe in the work of prayer. Well, whatever the reason is, I think insightfully, this is a reminder that there is a heavy lifting aspect, and this is the work we do. And I think what happens is, as we can get into in a minute kind of the nuances of how Paul talks about prayer, but as we do the heavy lifting of this idea of prayer and being disciplined and devoted, relentlessly persistent in prayer, then the other two things, walking wisely and engaging conversation, kind of emerge. Yeah. You know, we don't have to work as hard at those things because we've been before the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. We've surrendered ourselves to His supremacy, and He starts to shape us in prayer. And I fought the urge in the message, and I will faithfully fight the urge when I do the message on Sunday to lean into kind of railing against something I heard from a believing friend a few years ago. A disaster had occurred, a hardship was happening, across a people group, and there was a outpouring of we're praying, and this follower of Jesus looked at me with great sincerity and said, the last thing we need to do is say we're praying. We don't have time to pray. We need to do stuff. And I remember thinking in that moment, and again, fighting the urge to rail against that mentality, the first thing we ought to do is pray. I mean, and I go back to, and this leads us maybe into some of the further conversation about this. I go back to when I was a kid, and I grew up in a very functional home. My mom and dad to this day still are crazy in love with each other and married, and my dad has been an awesome role model throughout my life, and he was my hero growing up. But as a little boy, when something happened in my life, whether it was something that went bump in the night and I got scared, or something that happened at school that was particularly traumatic or whatever, my first thought was go tell Dad. Mm-hmm. Go tell Dad. Dad will know what to do. Yeah. Like Dad will know. He will either go fight for me, or he'll kill the monster under my bed, or whatever it is. But go tell Dad. Run to Dad. That was my first thought. I think that's a perfect picture of what Paul is saying to us about prayer. Yeah. Go tell Dad. Yep. Go spend time with Dad. Work at that. Don't neglect that. Relentlessly persist in prayer. Mm-hmm. And then when that happens, we become the kind of people who walk wisely and have a speech or a conversation that is seasoned with salt, filled with grace. And so that, obviously I leaned on prayer. I'd love to talk about wisdom and engagement, but that's kind of the big map of what we're thinking about this weekend. So. Yep.
And so that's what we're going to do now, is we're going to dive into those three categories and get even more practical, because that was already a really helpful shift into what does it look like to be devoted to prayer, because it's not just word count. Yeah. It's not just minutes or hours logged. It's the level of intentionality, and it's the focus. And so one of the things that we're going to say repeatedly today is the way we do something and why we do something, and I would go to the mat on this one, matters more than what we do. Yeah. The way we do something and why we do something matters more than what we do. And you see God through the prophet Isaiah talk about specifically prayer in the Old Testament, and complaining that what people are doing isn't in line with the way that it needs to be done and why it needs to be done when he says, my people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Yeah. And Jesus echoes that in the Gospels. He refers back to Isaiah and says, things haven't changed since the time of Isaiah. I'm here now, God in the flesh, and I'm still seeing it. I'm still seeing God's people honoring him with their lips, but their hearts are far from him. And so when we talk about being devoted to prayer, words need to be said. Yeah. This is beyond just, well, God knows how I feel. And you've talked about this before when you've been here of, I told my wife on our wedding day I loved her, so she knows and we're good. No. There is a level of intentionality that's needed. Paul says, be devoted to prayer with an alert mind and a thankful heart. Yeah. And that alert mind denotes a level of activity and action. Yeah. And even that word devoted, like you called out on Sunday, it's a necessary effort and it's relentless persistence. There is something to do here. And the way we do it and why we do it matters more.
Yeah, we've got to, and Paul is warning against this. We can't just assume God is eavesdropping on our conversations among other people, or he's reading our minds. Not that we have to pray out loud all the time. Not that there aren't times where quietly in our mind we are uttering prayers. But even in that quietly in our mind, it's not God is reading my thoughts that are subliminal and subconscious. There is a conscious shift in my mind of, in this moment, I am thinking about you and I am engaging in a mental conversation with you with deliberateness, not passively assuming that it's in. As I'm saying it, I'm thinking about how often you were a teacher, how often students, I didn't know that, and the instinct was, well, it's in the book. Okay, just because it's in the book, and we do that with God. Well, he knows it's in the book. It's in the book of my life, whatever that is. That Paul's reminding us, no, we have to be in conversation with him. And he, you mentioned that he leans into that, be alert and be thankful. And when you dig down in that, some people want to say, well, be alert, he's talking about end times. He's not in this passage. He's actually talking about being alert to the places in our life where we are either failing because of temptation, or we are in the position to be tempted and potential failure is coming. And being in a place of prayer where we do what David said in the Psalms, search me, O God, and know me, So give me the warning, God, or give me the necessary correction that I need, where I may have succumbed to temptation. That's the alertness he's talking about, is this will keep you from falling prey to, if you remember, this whole book was written this whole letter was written in response to the Colossian heresy, which was false and fraudulent representations of what was required to follow Jesus. And so he's saying, pray so that you won't fall prey to those temptations, those stumbling blocks, and then followed up with, some translations use the phrase, an attitude of thankfulness. That there is I have learned the discipline of thankfulness, and I think we've talked about it even on this podcast before. But what I realize is, even in the midst, and we as believers hold this treasure, that even in the midst of the worst things in life, the grace of God is still present. And because of the ever-present grace of God, I have reason to be thankful, even when it feels at times like nothing is working. The grace is still there. Great. And I love how it shows up in the middle. I mentioned this in the message. It shows up in the middle of the book of Lamentations, which is, the book of laments, the book of weeping. In the middle of it, Solomon, the writer, says, your mercies are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. In the middle of the weeping. And it's a perfect picture of exactly what Paul's saying relative to this attitude of thankfulness, that we come to God in prayer because every moment of every day we are recipients of his grace. And out of that we say, you are supreme. Now I'm coming to you, thankful for your supremacy in and your graciousness displayed towards me, and so that you can help me through the minefield that is this life filled with temptation and distractions. And so that's a bunch of words right there, John. Hopefully that's a little helpful.
No, and it is, because, and I think all of us recognize that our understanding of these things had its infancy somewhere else.
Yeah.
Often in our own infancy, right?
Yeah.
We saw it modeled growing up
Yeah.
in some way, shape, or form. And parts of it were probably helpful, and parts of it probably came out of somebody else's dysfunction.
Right.
And all of us are growing in our understanding of who God is. And even if the people around us understood who God was, the things that we saw from them, we may not have understood their why and their way. We just saw the what.
Right.
And seeing their what prompted us to create an understanding of, well, this must be why they do it, or this must be the way that they do it. And so it's always an invitation for every single one of us to come back to God, to learn how to pray. I mean, the disciples had it right when they asked Jesus, can you show us not only what words you say, for example, but what's the way that you pray? And so one of the most orienting things that Jesus did was the first word of what we now call the Lord's Prayer. Father, Abba, Daddy. Not the sovereign king of a distant nation with whom I have diplomatic relations, and I'm trying to either appease him or prevent him from invading. Which sometimes I've heard people pray, and I'm like, this is a diplomatic prayer. To the head of a foreign nation. That's not how you talk to Dad. That's not how you talk to Dad. And so when Paul says be devoted to prayer, again, this is not word count. This is not make sure you've asked for all the things that you want, otherwise you won't get them. Or make sure that you're thankful enough that God doesn't think you're unthankful and he, considers smiting. Be devoted to talking to your dad. Go to Dad, like you were talking about. Go to Dad because Dad knows. Because sometimes what we need is understanding. And that point, to your friend, I'm not going to hop on your bandwagon, but having a similar feeling of, you go back to the story of Nehemiah that we talked about last year, I think it was. Nehemiah hears about a need, and the first thing that he does is goes and prays, God, what do we do?
What should we do?
This bothers me. I'm pretty sure it bothers you, but I'm going to come check. And then what do we do about it so that I can do it with you? Be devoted to prayer, because sometimes what we need is understanding. Sometimes, like you said, what we need is forgiveness. There is something that God needs to address in us where we have fallen short, or we're on the cusp of falling short, and we're being either hard on ourselves, or we feel like God is, ready to crack down, and we need context and clarification. Sometimes it's strength. There's this beautiful section in Daniel where Daniel's been overcome through his prayer for his people, and God shows up and lifts him up and says, Daniel, you're precious. You're precious to me. And he gives Daniel strength. Because Daniel's been devoted to prayer. There's so many things that we don't have time to say about this, but the gist of it is, we have all learned a subset of prayer. And all of us are invited into a more full understanding of what prayer is, because of who our prayer is not only to, but with.
And I'd add one more thing to your list. Sometimes we need time.
Only one?
Well, for now. Sometimes what we need is time. I'm at a place in my life where I just like being with my dad.
Exactly. It's just connection.
And I think about, we often hear people talk about that passage in Hebrews where we are invited to approach the throne. And there's a word that gets translated sometimes, let us boldly approach the throne of grace. And I think that you've articulated it very well, that sometimes we see, we have the access to approach the king's throne. I'm going to negotiate, or I'm going, on some kind of international relations, diplomatic duty. But the invitation and to come boldly into his presence is not boldly because I've got the title of ambassador or diplomat. It's because I'm his son. I belong there. We get to play at the feet of the king.
Yep.
And I think embedded in this, the reason Paul is so strong in his language, be devoted, continue earnestly, relentlessly persistent in prayer, is spending time with Dad is good.
Yes.
And it's the relational component there. And we can't just assume, it'd be very easy for me to go, well, I have his name. I grew up in his home. I talked to him, last year. That's not sufficient,
Yeah.
And no more it's no more sufficient for that in my relationship with God than it is in my relationship with my earthly father.
Exactly. Yeah. We said at the beginning, the way we do something and why we do something matters more than what we do.
Yeah.
And so we've got right here, why we do it is because it's a relationship.
Yeah.
And so that effort and persistence that Paul is talking about is the effort and persistence that you put into developing a relationship.
Right.
It's the effort and persistence that you put into developing your marriage. This isn't just about, well, I have to do certain things to get what I want out of this relationship or to keep them happy. No, there's effort and persistence in a marriage because it's all about connection.
Yeah.
And it's about a deepening and a developing of that connection over your lifetime.
Yeah.
And by the way, it's the same thing that parents try to do with kids. This isn't just about how do I get them to do what I want or keep them happy. It's how do I develop a relationship, a connection for the rest of our lives together.
Right.
That's the invitation when Paul talks about be devoted to prayer.
Yeah.
Be devoted to cultivating this relationship with your dad who loves you because you're his kid.
Yeah.
And yes, there are things you need from him, and there are things that he will want to do for you. But at the end of the day, spend time with your dad.
Yeah. I'm just sitting here thinking about our human relationships, our earthly relationships, and I'm just flipping the script just a little bit. And the text is about our work, but I'm thinking about God's perspective in this, and I'm betting that it's likely that some of our viewers, listeners, are parents of teenagers. And the teen years are those years when you as a teenager pull away from your parents. It's like your parents aren't cool, they
don't know anything.
All they're trying to do is ruin the fun, all that. And as a parent, I think back to when my girls were teens, I wanted to spend time with them, not to reprimand them.
Right.
I just wanted to hang. I loved them. I love them. I shouldn't say that in the past
Whether
tense.
or not they think I'm cool, they're cool.
I love them, and I love hanging out with them. And even now, both of my girls are grown and adults and off, chasing their dreams in the world. And I'm very proud of what they're doing. But there's no more satisfying time than when we're together. I love them, and I think it's worth saying, even though Paul's talking about our effort and our side of the equation, I think it's worth saying, one of the reasons we should be devoted to prayer is that our Father wants to be with us. He loves us. He wants to spend time with us. And it's not always because he wants to hit us with a rod.
Right.
He just loves us and made us for fellowship with him.
Yeah, exactly. So out of that place of connection, out of that place of effort in cultivating a connection that is mutually desirable and mutually beneficial, mutually enjoyable, out of that comes these two other things that you were talking about on Sunday. Be wise in how you live among those who are not believers, and be engaging in how you speak so that your speech is gracious and attractive.
Yeah.
So be wise in how you live, and you were pointing out this before we hit record. All of this is pointed outward.
Yeah.
All of this is pointed outward. And so be wise in how you live. If we stop the phrase there and forget the end, this isn't about, be wise in how I live, do smart things, don't do dumb things,
Right.
Ration resources appropriately. It's be wise in how you live among those who are not believers. This is the why behind it. The why is recognizing there are good and right things that should be done, even if they're uncomfortable, because they're going to have an effect on the people around me, as well as me.
Right.
But the way I need to go and do those things involves going and doing those things.
Yeah.
Not just thinking about those things, not just acknowledging that they are good things that someone should do.
Right.
But that there is a call to action that will affect the lives of the people around me.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that is easy to miss in the narrative of Scripture is that there are a lot of things that we do that are effort on our part, but we do them not so much because I've set out to, check off a to-do list, but we do them because we've caught the heart of the Father.
Yes.
So we've spent time with our dad, and we've become more and more like him. Yeah. That's what time does for us. Yes. And so as we become more and more like him, we begin to care about the things that he cares about. Yeah. We start to share those passions, and at the very center of the heart of God is man. Or humanity, right, if I'm going to be gender neutral, but he cares about human beings, and God loves people, and he loves everyone. Yeah. And we celebrate that as those who are found, but can forget that that's also true for those who are not found. And so when we're with the Father and we're spending time with the Father, his heart grows in us, and what happens is we start to care about those people as well. Yeah. And so there is work that we do on this, but it's more of a natural effort than the devoted to prayer aspect. Yeah. That out of our time with our Father, our passion for people grows, and we start to order our lives in a way that will affect people towards experiencing what we're experiencing with Jesus being greater in our life. And so Paul talks about walking wisely, and you're right, you can't put the period in the sentence there, because if you do, then we just talk about, a circumspect living. Are we moral? Are we, religious? All of those words that we would attach to particular behaviors that we would say are disciplines of following Jesus. But he actually expands it and says, no, you make choices to live your life in a way that represents Jesus in a compelling fashion, such that those who haven't experienced him as being greater have access to experiencing him as being greater. And if you think back over this series, for those of you that have been here for the series, or if you've gone back and watched the series, think about how many times in the course of these chapters and these messages we've said, you do this because others are watching, because others have access. If you don't do this, you're keeping people out. And so much of this particular book is really about ordering our lives in a way that others will not only see Jesus, but access him, experience a relationship with him. And this walking wisely, actually, if you even just listen to last week's message, Brian's whole message kind of came down to living in particular relationships, and he works through certain relationships in the culture where Paul was, living in particular relationships in a way that allows those who have not yet embraced Jesus to be able to get past who you are and see Jesus. And I think he's building on that.
Yeah, and one of the things that I'm struck by, just as we're talking about this, is the call to be wise. That word wisdom is significant. Yeah. Because wisdom requires experience.
Right.
You don't get wisdom just from hearing someone else saying and intellectually acknowledging, oh, that sounds like a good thing. I think that sounds smart. I agree with that. I did my internet research and confirmed that is in fact the case. Right. And we can now move on with our lives, acknowledging that this is a universal truth. Right. No. When Paul says be wise in how you live, that means you need to go live in a way. Yeah. You need to go experience living in a way that confirms for you, this is what's true, because I've lived it. Right. And so, like you talked about, referencing back to the last chapter of Colossians that Paul was writing, there were some things that he said to go do because there are some things that are objectively true. You are objectively a new creation. Right. Objectively, the old you is now dead, thanks to the sacrifice of Jesus. Objectively, there is a new you that is born in Christ, that is empowered by Christ, that lives with Christ. And so there's some things to go do, not to check boxes, not to meet requirements, not to satisfy a vengeful God, but because this is now what's compatible with you, and you didn't know that before. Right. So go do things like put off sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, greed, anger, rage, malicious behavior, slander, and dirty language. Go practice seeing that you don't actually need those anymore to have whatever internally they did for you, and Go practice putting off those things to see the effect they have on the people around you. And then, oh, by the way, go practice putting on things that maybe you weren't accustomed to.
Right.
Go practice putting on things that are compatible with your new nature, like mercy, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience, forgiveness, love, and peace. And then see what happens when you do that, not only in you, but in the world around you. And then, by the way, put that into practice in your closest relationships. Do that with your spouse. Put off that stuff, put on that stuff, and see what happens with your spouse. See what happens with your kids. See what happens with your employers or employees. See the change that comes, and people start to realize, oh my God, literally.
Right.
There's no other way. There's no other way. And you have to go experience that. It's not enough to read what Paul knows because Paul lived it. Paul's invitation is, I know this to be true. You have to go live it so that you experience it as truth.
And I think we're plagued in our culture by a couple of kind of frames of thinking culturally, and it's the time in which we live that affect this. One, we're a microwave culture. We want it now. And the other is we're a perfection culture. And we want it perfect. And those two things are enemies, quite frankly, of wisdom. And so what happens is in this, I want it now, I want it fast, we trade wisdom, for knowledge. And I want it perfect, we trade wisdom for the laboratory theory, and we go, okay, in a sterile environment, blah, blah, blah. And we think through, I can't do this because I can't do it right, perfect. I can't do this, for whatever reason. Or we think, well, I know it, I've got it. And I think about, and I think I may have told this story before in a podcast conversation, so I'll tell it kind of fast. We used to take students and college and high school students and train them how to share their faith. And one of the parts of our training was we teach you the process of telling the story of Jesus, but we'll also teach you how to answer some of the tough questions. But what we did that was most profound and most effective was we sent them out for half of the time to just have conversations with people. And we would have this conversation, those of us that led the experience, we would have this conversation that's the most profound thing, because what happened in the morning when we were training them is kids would start thinking, or students would start thinking, okay, I know the answer, I know the answer, I know the answer. And as soon as they offered their answer, the person on the street's like, but. And now they've got to figure out how to apply the answer, and after a period of time, they got better at being able to respond to the questions, to the challenges. But it wasn't because of what they learned; it was because of what they experienced. And wisdom is knowledge that's gained through experience, and you can't go any other way. And so, Paul will talk about, like, for example, in Corinthians, one of the things he says to that body of people is, you've been doing this a long time and you're still taking the milk. Now, there's an assumption there that there's a period of time where the milk's good, but enough experience ought to move you out of the milk to the meat, is what he's saying in that particular passage. And now I'm way off the reservation in terms of the passage we're talking about. However, the idea of wisdom is just what you said. It's okay, I've got a new identity. I've got this new creation in me, and I am systematically, checking boxes and putting to death the old, but I'm also in the check the box experience. I'm gaining wisdom about that. And I'm learning, I don't have to be this kind of person, because what happened when I followed the code, I realized, I'm learning there's better, and there's more, and there's deeper, and there's, and so this idea of walking wisely, living wisely, is the idea of living it out and learning from it, and living it out and learning from it, and living it out and learning from it, and using what you've learned to become more and more and more proficient at being who you were created to be.
Exactly.
And that's again, our culture shorts us on wisdom, through those mentalities.
So. And it's so funny, Brian was talking last Sunday about context as the most important thing. And one of the things that we have to realize is the context in which Jesus lived, the context in which Paul lived, was much more of I won't say it was perfectly but it was much more of a apprenticeship culture.
Right.
Than a perfectionist culture.
Yes.
There was a baked in understanding that anything that I pursue is going to take time to develop skill and understanding in. And so that's okay.
Right.
And not only is that okay, like we'll tolerate it, but that is good and right.
Right. It's good, healthy learning.
Right.
Yeah.
And so when Jesus says, come and follow me, he didn't say, come with me and have it all right before we step one foot on the road.
Exactly.
He said, come and follow me, which implies there are some things you're going to need to learn and you're going to need to practice that you don't understand and that are not natural and comfortable yet. And so I want you to come follow me. I want you to come spend time with me. I want you to come spend prolonged time with me because that's what it's going to take for this to become natural.
And the Gospels are filled with the illustration of that. I mean, just in a very simple way, think about how many times Jesus says to the disciples, oh, you have such little faith.
Right.
and it wasn't, you're bad. Oh, you're out.
Why aren't you perfect at this yet?
It was, okay, you're still growing.
There's still
you're
more.
still growing. You're still growing.
Yeah.
Your faith is still growing. And I mean, and there's plenty of other illustrations beyond the faith illustration of how Jesus says, okay, go try this.
Right.
And then they come back and go, we tried it. It didn't work.
Right. Right. Or it worked here, but not here.
Exactly.
And that's the invitation is that to become wise, you have to go do things. Like you said about those students, you have to go do things and realize where your knowledge is insufficient.
Exactly.
It's not that your knowledge was wrong.
Right.
But Paul didn't say, be knowledgeable in how you live among those who are not yet believers. It wasn't have the right answers and disseminate those as needed.
Right.
It was go learn how to be wise among those who are not believers.
And I thought about this as I was studying that and pondering that particular statement that Paul makes. And I thought, it's not wisdom if you don't act on the experience or the learning experience.
Yes.
And so he says, look, you gotta do the wisdom.
You do.
That's what wisdom is.
Right.
Doing what you learned.
Yeah.
And so, you go, you scrape your knee, burn your fingers, whatever it is. But then the next time you do it again. Yeah. You don't stop doing it. Oh, I went out there, I fell down, messed it up. Now I know, okay, I'll never do that again.
Right.
It's not that.
Yeah.
Wisdom is putting into practice that which you've learned through experience.
Yep.
And or at least living wisely is putting into practice that which you've learned from your experiences. And so I love that he doesn't just leave it at be wise, but he says live wisely.
Particularly among those who are not believers.
Yes.
And it ties back to and so this is why you need to be devoted to prayer.
Right.
Because it's not going to work sometimes in the way that you thought it would.
Yeah.
You are going to find that your knowledge was insufficient for the task at hand or the response to it.
Yeah.
You knew the right answer, but knowing the right answer didn't get the response you were hoping for. And so, God, what do I do now? And that's the invitation. Go to Dad. Go to Dad.
Yeah.
You are not sent out to be self-sufficient.
Yeah.
You are sent out dependently.
Yeah.
You go with. That's why he gave us this
so
many words.
Message.
So many words.
Such a powerful closing argument.
So many words. So, and as you grow in wisdom, living among those who are not believers, be engaging in how you speak. Yeah. Let your conversation be gracious and attractive.
Yeah.
And so here again, why? Well, because there are things that others need to hear. Right. There is correct knowledge that would be beneficial and will be beneficial to those that have not yet heard it or not yet understood it or not yet assented to it.
Yeah.
But what's the way? The way is be gracious and attractive so that they can hear it.
Yeah. So in some translations, the translation John and I are looking at right now says be attractive. Some translations say seasoned with salt.
Yep.
And it makes for a fun play on words, have salty speech, which kind of in our culture suggests either something that's unseemly or seedy or pejorative, like you're in a bad mood kind of thing. But for Paul,
be snarky, be sarcastic, be edgy.
But for Paul in his culture, when he said seasoned with salt, that what they heard was be witty. be funny, be interesting, be relevant.
Yeah.
Even the sages of the day would use that phrase to describe wisdom. Like there's something compelling about what you're talking about. And so if you look at kind of his run through there as he describes the kind of conversation, he talks about graciousness. He talks about being seasoned with salt, being salty, which, again, I love that. And then he kind of lands on having a right answer. And so there is kind of a little, in my mind, and I fought the urge, even in the message, to just say, I'm just going to ask you 3 questions underneath this. Like is what you're saying gracious? Like that, man, that changed the narrative of social media completely.
Nice.
And I am not an avid user of social media. I just read it, kind of thing. So, and I go through times where I go, I wish I just could disconnect it all, because it just wounds me, and it wounds me how we talk to each other. Like even people who I go, you're on the same team. Why are you talking to each other the way that you talk to each other? We're mean, we're harsh, we're short, we're insensitive, I could just keep adding words. And that, even when I was reading this, and I've said before, from the platform as I've preached, that, one of the things that I pray over my life is that the older I get, the kinder I'll be.
Yeah.
And it's an aspiration I have as I age to age well in kindness, that I would grow in kindness. But as I was reading that, once again, it almost took my breath away, just that pause of, man, am I talking to people with a graciousness about my speech? Is the way that I engage them pleasant and kind and genteel, or is it harsh and pejorative? Am I trying to prove a point? Am I talking over them? Am I, all of those kinds of things, both extreme and minor, that show up as far from gracious.
Right.
And he says, when we are with our Father, when we're with Dad, and he rubs off on us, the kindness of God will rub off on us. Mm-hmm. And as recipients of grace, we're in the driver's seat of understanding what it means to be treated graciously. Yeah. Man, then that should make us proficient at distributing that. And so he starts with that, be gracious, but then be seasoned with salt. Right. Think through how you're having this conversation in a way that doesn't cause people to just glaze over.
Right.
Like, here's how Jesus affects your life.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things we have a experience that we do called Living on Mission, and I do a session that's strictly focused on how do you tell the story of Jesus. Mm-hmm. What's the nuts and bolts of helping people move from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of light. And one of the things that I love to do at the very end of it, one of my last points that I make, is find the fingerprints of God. Because I think the fingerprints of God are everywhere. And so I'm a hobbyist photographer, so I'll take some of my pictures of random things, mm-hmm. And I'll just hand them out and say, okay, I want you to look at this picture and tell me where you see God in this picture. It's very fascinating to listen to people now go, hey, I looked at this picture and here's God in this guitar sign, mm-hmm. and here's how I saw it. And I think a part of that discipline is being able to say, I want to have a conversation with you that's interesting to you.
Right.
That is something that will catch your attention and will maybe redirect how you're processing something.
Right.
Could be, I have the great privilege, you have the great privilege in the roles that we play of dealing with people in mm-hmm. traumatic experience. Yeah. Those are moments where we can say, okay, let me show you the fingerprints of God in this. Mm-hmm. Through weeping, but mm-hmm. I can reframe your thinking and you can see the fingerprints of God. On the same token, I can be at a coffee shop and build a friendship with the people who are there in the coffee shop, and I can have a different kind of conversation. Yep. But I can say, here's a thing that you connect to, yeah. and that you are interested in. Here's the fingerprints of God.
Yeah,
that's the seasoned with salt, or be attractive, be interesting, be engaging, be be relevant. I love that one of the commentaries that I read used that word, that I'm not just going to preach a sermon to you and and you've seen that. I mean, and I've been guilty of doing it at times where you get that blank stare of going, I hear you talking, but I'm really not listening.
And all the words are right.
Exactly.
But it's not connecting with me where I am.
Yeah.
And if it's not connecting with them where they are, what's the point?
Yeah.
I've said all the right words, but it's the tree. If a tree falls in the forest and nobody
hears,
right? If they can't hear what I'm saying, did I really say anything?
Right.
And that go back to wisdom. The old adage of if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all.
Yeah.
And people, but sometimes okay, fine, but apply that here. If you can't say something gracious and attractive, don't say anything.
Right.
Or maybe, and here's where we'll get to a couple of practical things that maybe you weren't thinking of at first. If the goal is to be wise in how we live among those who are not believers and be engaging in how we speak so that we can have helpful responses for the people around us, maybe rather than starting with statements, we start with questions.
Absolutely.
There was a phenomenal book that I read a couple years ago by a guy named Randy Newman that was called Questioning Evangelism. And that's not being skeptical about evangelism. This is how you can do evangelism, is through asking questions.
Right.
And it's such a brilliant invitation to don't lead with answers, lead with questions, and get curious about people in their context.
Yeah.
Engage with them because that's how people feel engaged.
Yeah.
And then, like you were talking about, as you're training people, think about some of the questions that people might ask once they realize you're having a spiritual conversation.
Right.
And think about the reasons. And I heard somebody else, a guy named Michael Ramsden, talk about this. Think about the questions people might ask, but think about the reasons why they might ask that. So when people come with the, okay, but, don't just prepare yourself for the intellectual response to the intellectual, but.
Right.
Think about why. Think about the story of a person and what might prompt them to say, but.
Right.
Because in most cases, it's not intellectual discourse that prompts people to ask a but rhetorical or response question. It's usually a place of pain. It's usually a place of confusion. It's usually a place of concern for themselves or someone else. And so that but is not an invitation to let's debate at an intellectual level. It's, can you actually come into my context and provide a response that's helpful and engaging? And so think about those things.
One of the things, and questions are, I think, one of, if not the best tool for doing this, for seasoning our conversation with salt, because we can respond to what has come out of the heart of the other person. And one of my favorite processes that I go through, I'll use it illustratively. One of the things that I have the privilege of doing as a pastor is weddings. And there was a period of time, because of a variety of things that we don't have time to go into in my life, where I was just kind of people, by virtue of hearing that I was a pastor off the street, were like, hey, would you do our wedding? And I was very interested in that. And I saw that as an opportunity for ministry. And I said, okay, here's the deal. I'll do your wedding, but I'm not, the wedding officiant for hire. I'll do your wedding if you'll agree to meet with me 4 times before. And my first meeting with them was 100% questions. Tell me your story. I want to hear your story. And then I got to ask questions about their story. I got to lead with my questions. And often found myself then being able to say, well, okay, so let me show you the fingerprints of God on your story. And that I love that question. Sometimes that's just, I'll meet somebody for the first time. We'll sit down. I remember being at a coffee shop up the street here from us just a few months ago with somebody, sat down, introduced myself and said, okay, so tell me your story. That was exactly how the question went. And then from there, I learned all these things, and I'm in an ongoing now relationship with this person, helping them discover Jesus. But it started with, just tell me your story. I want to hear your story, because now I can have a conversation with you about you and about things that matter to you, and you are far more likely to be attracted
Yes.
to and engaged in
Yes.
that. Beyond that, it shows that you aren't just a project to me.
Right.
I genuinely care, and that's gracious.
Yeah.
That's the graciousness
Yeah.
part of it. So I think questions are our best tool.
Yeah.
And I think the part, just to kind of circle back to the last aspect, what Paul says there is be ready to give a right answer. And that, I think, goes back to something he said earlier in the book where he said, be rooted and grounded.
Yeah.
That's us knowing, why do I have this confidence? Why is Jesus supreme? Why have I made him greater in my life? And I may not know all the right answers, but I should grow in my ability to give an answer for that. Paul challenged, Peter challenged his readers to be prepared to give an answer for our faith.
Right.
And so he's saying, if you're gracious and you're seasoned with salt or you're attractive, you're now going to have an opportunity to speak truth.
Yeah. People are going to ask a question.
That'll let you speak
And so if
truth.
someone asks,
Speak truth.
yeah,
Yeah.
you're ready to explain it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So the hope is this has been helpful, as always.
Yeah.
The hope is that this has not just provided some helpful suggestions on things you can do, but it's provided some helpful reframing of the way that we do it and why we do it, because the way we do something and why we do something matters more than what we do.
Yeah.
And I'm reminded just as we close that because of the way that we've been talking about be wise and be engaging, it places the entire emphasis on connection rather than information.
Yeah.
And that's what we said all of this flows out of, is being devoted to prayer, because it's about devotion to developing a connection, not just being devoted to doing the things that we think we're supposed to do.
Yeah, I think it's important for us to just take a half a pause and think about the entirety of what this little book has been saying. Jesus is greater, and we can pause there and focus on that, and we would be appropriate to do that. And it's overwhelming and it's awesome. Yeah. But the reason that it's important is that every single human being, God desires for them to experience the greatness of Jesus. And I love that embedded in this little simple 5-verse closing argument is this whole relational thing.
Yep.
Relationship with our Father that leads to relationship with others.
Yep.
And I think it's worth noting that in a season and culture that is increasingly less connected, the best thing that could happen in our life is for us to become more connected.
Amen.
Be connected with him and be connected with others.
Absolutely. So friends, as always, thanks for letting us be a part of your journey. It's truly a privilege and an honor. And thank you for being a part of ours, because we're all still in process too.
Absolutely.
But this has been a lot of fun. 9 weeks on not just the objective reality that Jesus is greater, but experiencing the reality of Jesus being greater in our life and the effect that has on the people around us.
Yeah.
So we've got more fun things to come. So catch us next week and you'll see what those are. But until then, he's Lee, I'm Jon, and we'll see you next time.